International Forum on Reform and Opening Up and Poverty Reduction in China kicks off in Beijing. Starting with the rural reforms, China has made huge progress in economic and social transformation and made a significant contribution to the UN's Millennium Poverty Reduction Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, and the 2030 Agenda. Now, with 2 years left to meet its own target, China needs to lift a further 30 million people out of poverty. What is the link between China's reform and opening up and rural development? In what ways is poverty one of the biggest challenges to human rights? And how can China and other countries share experience for further success in the fight against poverty? To discuss these and other issues, I'm very pleased to be joined in the studio by Akmal Burkhanov, Director of the Development Strategy Center, Uzbekistan, Professor Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Economic Cooperation in the Ministry of Commerce, and Anna Tangen, current affairs commentator. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's look at this.
On track to reaching a major goal, China has lifted more than 700 million people out of poverty in the last 4 decades. And it aims to eradicate its poverty by 2020, a miracle many other countries hope to emulate. Leaders of global organizations share what can be learned from China.
The first is that China's Reform and Opening Up program, which was the foundation for the rapid growth that allowed people to lift themselves out of poverty. And second, a focused and sustained effort targeted at poverty reduction throughout the reform period, both an opening up and a focus on poverty.
Is China's leadership on designing a development process that in many ways built into its own strategy something that we only agreed as an international community in 2015, that development should leave no one behind. This is one of the powerful commitments of the Sustainable Development Goals.
But on the other hand, China is also reaching out through multiple poverty alleviation projects overseas. China Development Bank, a major policy bank, says it has now invested some 80 billion yuan or $11 billion into projects of its kind in countries along the Belt and Road.
For example, to support poverty alleviation in Indonesia, we've helped improve the local palm trees. And in Malawi, we've involved in developing its cotton industry via equity investment. And it will be mutually beneficial when the high-quality cotton is imported to countries like China.
Uzbekistan launched its latest round of reforms last year. With more than 10% of its population still struggling with poverty, it's also seeking international cooperation in this field.
Last week, we've participated on Central Asia Uzbekistan Forum on Technologies. We agreed to create the Uzbekistan-Chinese Innovation Center.
China still has some 3 years to try to lift the remaining 30 million rural people out of poverty. But the message from the forum is clear that the confidence of the Chinese government and the international community is strong. Wang Mengzhen, CGTN, Beijing.
Welcome to our discussion here. China is obviously one of the biggest labor markets in the world. However, with the growing pressure of economic downward pressure, what do you think of the situation for job creation? I mean, President Xi Jinping has just hosted a morale-boosting conference to show up confidence of both investors and consumers concerning prospects of the Chinese economy. If more small and medium-sized enterprises are likely to go bankrupt, I mean, next year we're going to have a bleak picture of the job market. What do you think?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, SME is playing a very important role for job creation, especially in China. More than 90% of job opportunities provided by those SME. So that's why today, for both central government and the local government, very appreciate job issues, because every year in China there are more than 10 million young generation, and they need to have a job. Also today, China is already become a so-called middle-income country. For every young person, for monthly wage, monthly salary, at least maybe in the big cities, more than 4,000, 5,000 Chinese yuan at this type of level. So that means we have to provide more and more job opportunities. So SME will play this type of role.
Recently, policy options have been rolled out to raise the threshold of a personal individual income. And a lot of measures are being taken by the central government, for example, to help alleviate poverty. What do you think of, say, the job situation?
Okay, let's separate. Poverty is one thing. The job creation and the economy of the nation is another. I mean, even without all of these pluses, China enjoyed 6.6% increase in disposable income nationwide, and that's including an inflation or any kind of allowance for inflation. So China is going forward. The concern here is the economic engine itself. This is what the opening up was about. So what they're trying to do is make sure that this remains stable, and that's where Xi Jinping was trying to assure the nation through the last economic meeting that yes, things are unsteady. The country is forging ahead. There have been some weaknesses in some of the industrial outputs, and this is just a way of calming the nerves, making sure people understand where China's economic interests lie, especially in terms of its domestic market, consumption, and how it is dealing with poverty.
We are discussing, Mr. Birkenhoff, we are discussing the relevance between poverty reduction campaign that is well underway, 2 years left before we completely eliminate the issue of poverty in China 4 decades after the opening up. The relationship between this forum on poverty reduction and the conference that President Xi Jinping hosts to boost the development of small and medium-sized enterprises and to let people from the private economy feel more confident about the future. Do you see any close link between the two events?
Of course, it should be noted that this year is very significant for China, because not for China but only for whole world, because this year in September China celebrated the 5th anniversary of Belt and Road Initiative. It's the global initiative, and also this year is the anniversary of 14th anniversary of the reform, opening up reform policy of China. And China could show to the world that they can reduce the poverty reform. And today, before this conference, I've attended to some field study to Henan province and Shenzhen province, and we evidenced that China began this policy from the rural areas also, and we saw that China is fighting with poverty not only with job creating, but also it's in prism of new evolution and new modernization. So not only they are creating jobs, not only in agriculture, but also in new technologies, innovation technologies also.
Well, I just like to add one sentence. That is, just relying on agriculture sector is not easy, for most of people, to solve the problems of poverty. So that's why job issues is very critical for those people who are living in poverty. You know that in China, very valuable experiences that by industrialization and urbanization, a lot of people, they can have job opportunities in urban areas, and especially in SME. So they can, have their income, higher income than their incomes in, agriculture sectors. And then, poverty reductions, becomes more and more, popular.
What do you think of the assurances provided by the authorities at different levels, for example, to make sure that those who have no jobs would not have a sense of desperation? They would see their own future with the help of the government. Does that have anything to do with the Social Security, for example, in the United States? What does the United States do to ensure the basic line of survival?
Well, that survival line is going down. Donald Trump is not in favor of it. It's a kind of, the poor should take care of themselves, they're lazy, this kind of attitude. But the truth is, the United States has a 12.3 percent of its population which is in poverty. This is astounding for a country that is as rich in resources and money and everything else.
But I'm afraid the standard of the poverty is different from China to the United States.
It's different, but when you don't have enough to eat, it's the same. So don't make a mistake. Just because people have, quote, more money, it doesn't mean that they can buy what they need to sustain themselves. Out of that number, there's over 40 million people in poverty, and about 11 million of those are children. They're not getting enough to eat. It's going to affect their development, and this is one of the issues. Now, in terms of how the U.S. deals with it, yes, there's a host of programs that have been started. But what happens is, instead of their kind of stop and go, instead of having a sustained drive to try to eliminate the problem or at least deal with it, what you have is one administration, and depending on the party in power, will say we're going to do this, and then the next administration changes that, and the next, and next, and next. So you lack the kind of sustainable drive that China has developed.
Uzbekistan is one of the members of the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and that's a platform for countries, low-income economies in Central Asia to jump on the wagon of China's prosperity. It could be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think this is an opportunity you got to seize for alleviation of the poverty in the individual economies?
Of course, Uzbekistan also now is facing the new reform, because after became the new president of Uzbekistan, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, last year in January last year. So we also created our strategy, 5-year strategy of developing of our country, and we are really interested in contribute and cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative and under the SCO cooperation. So we also have some joint projects with China, in support with China. This is a railway construction or new tunnel constructions, which is connect China to Central Asia and also to Europe also. So I think first of all, the Belt and Road Initiative is very influential to the Central Asian countries and SCO countries.
Look,
when
we look at the issue of a Belt and Road Initiative, New York Times contributed one influential article saying China is deliberately building up the debt trap. If that is allowed to continue, this article argues that the poverty scenario will get even worse in the developing countries that China is expected to help. What do you think of the impact of the article concerning the so-called debt trap?
No, I don't think so, because Belt and Road Initiative is not the initiative of China or interest of China, only China. We have to understand that Belt and Road Initiative must be interested each country, and we take interested moments and key parts of this initiative. We have to integrate our reforms also with one Belt Road Initiative. So I don't think that...
How do you... Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the pet peeves I have, is that people talk about this as in isolation. So they'll talk about some port and they'll say, oh, gee, this country is small. Why do they need a big port? But that port will only become valuable and start making valuable returns when it's connected up to a system. It's just like if I build a road in the middle of the desert and it's not connected to anything, and people say, well, why would you do that? That's not meaningful. But if I connect that road up to other centers and I start developing along it, then it becomes valuable. So this is kind of a no-win situation in terms of, they accuse China. If China did nothing, they'd say, oh, China's rich, it's developing, it's not doing anything. If China tries to do something, they say, oh, China's trying to establish an empire. So you're in a no-win situation. But this conference is not only about what China has done. There's 400 billion renminbi that has been sent out to help foreign nations in 160 countries, 66 countries, I'm sorry. There have been tens of thousands of Chinese volunteers who've gone out, some volunteers, some sent out by the government, to train hundreds of thousands of people in how China has done this and to suggest ways. So this is another part where China is trying to go global, take some of what it has learned, not force it on people, but simply say, we're here to help.
Yeah, very briefly. Actually, I think China has had a successful story on poverty reduction in the past, just because two types of very important experiences. The first one is, if you want to be rich, the first thing is to pave the road. So this type of
in
road,
Chinese 要想富先修路
right? Yeah, that means infrastructure, including energy station, power stations, and railway, road, ports, something like that. And secondly, that is without industrialization, it would be impossible for you to get rich, because I emphasize that in urban areas, by those factory plants, and their income would be higher, much more than their income in rural areas. So in this regard, on platform of Belt and Road Initiative from Chinese side, we already said that we will not export China's model, because China has a very unique situation, but we can export our valuable experiences. That means a lot of countries, they can have opportunities to getting out of poverty.
Anna, I believe you are in China long enough to understand how and why this campaign of a modernization drive had actually kicked off. First of all, in Anhui province, where a group of farmers actually inaugurated the impressive project of family responsibility system. So the first step of poverty reduction actually started in rural areas, and from coastal areas to inland. And this is basically the roadmap of China's poverty alleviation.
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts of it. This is not about the government does everything. I mean, I think people look at China and they say, oh, it's a communist country. The government does everything. And I've had that questions asked me by leaders of other countries. I said, no, it was unlocking the individual potential. What they said is, after you've fulfilled your quota, all right, everything after that is yours. And within a couple of years, China changed from being in danger of having enough to eat to having more than it could eat. And this shows that this idea that the market has a very vital place to play. You have to have incentives to individuals. But on the other hand, you have to have a government that is controlling the situation. It is organizing these attempts. This poverty reduction, when you think that there's 30 million in China that are in need of this kind of effort, and there are 40 million in the U.S., which has 1/3 of the population. It's astounding. I mean, and to create this effort, now we can talk about whether $1.90 a day or the different values, but the fact is, what is happening in other countries around the world to deal with this pressing problem? Almost everywhere else, we're talking about the Gini index. What's happening to the rest of the world is the rich get richer and the poor are ignored.
So as I'm concerned, one economist with the United Nations won Nobel Prize for Economics because he designed a plan for providing poverty-stricken farmers with small loans so that they were able to start their small businesses. Now, having discussed a little bit the land reform or land redistribution that took place 40 years ago in China, in rural areas, what do you think of a similar situation in Central Asian nations or other developing countries? Do you think land reform is crucially important for the eradication of poverty?
Of course, not only the land reforms. Today also during the conference we discussed this issue. We already noticed it about industrialization and rural housing and also the job creation. But this is the main point. One other main point is to change the mind of the poor people, because they think, for example, in Central Asia, we are the post-Soviet country. So during the Soviet Union, you were the socialistic, communistic, and socialistic republic, and without any work, you could get from the country, from the government. So this is difficult to change the mind of our people, especially Central Asian people. So if you give, they want more. So if you give them land, or if you give them the house, they use the house, but they don't think the further development of their house, the family. That is the problem in our country also. So that's why we have to think. So you also mentioned that in the article. So not only you have to provide not only the land, but also building the capacity building of changing their mind, and also you have to give them opportunity to create a new business or family business.
What Mr. Deng Xiaoping, our late senior leader, architect of the modernization drive, said 40 years ago in China. He said he did two things. One was to emancipate the mind, the other to seek truth from facts. And therefore, President Xi Jinping echoes much the same message by saying we must first of all eradicate the poverty that exists in our minds before we eradicate it in the regions that we govern. So what do you think of the importance of education to change the old mindset of particularly those who are struggling with the issue of poverty?
Yeah, I think this is the most important and the most fundamental things for poverty reduction. You know that actually in many places in China, especially in those rural areas and in those mountain areas, the lack of enough education resources and opportunities, and generation by generation just relying on so traditional living style, and then it's very difficult for them to escape from the poverty. So right now I think that more and more public education, also more and more public training courses for those young generations. That means those young generations, they will have new capacity to have their new business, and they have their skills to have their jobs, and step by step I think that they can
yes, of course, the improvement of the skills, labor skills is an important part for poverty alleviation. But Anna, we have 56 ethnic groups in China. Some of them live in the remote, poverty-stricken mountainous areas, and many of those who have lived there for centuries refuse to be relocated. Now, I went to Australia to cover the Olympic Games in the year 2000, and I was alarmed by some of the media coverage on the defiance and the refusal of local Aboriginal people who just say no to the government when they were to be relocated from the extremely poverty-stricken areas to the more prosperous areas. Because China is doing much the same, right? To relocate the poverty-stricken population from mountainous areas to the coastal areas, and we give quota to the individual governments at the local level so that they can absorb some of the economic asylum seekers.
It's absolutely necessary. If you start looking at the decline in areas, especially in Rust Belt areas in England, in the United States, the big mistake they made is they just left people there. They gave them small stipends. There wasn't enough to live well, but they became dependent on it. And this kind of welfare society is not good either. So you have to do it. And this is where you go back to this education. But I would, people should know exactly how China is doing this. It's not just educating people, it's how you educate them. The central government isn't sending slogans to these villagers saying, get up, be prosperous. They send 3 officials to live in the village so they understand the actual problems of that village, those families. In some cases, it's people who have mental defects or physical defects. They're not going to be in a situation where they're going to be able to do very much, but they have to be taken care of. So the government says in those particular cases, yes, there will be subsidies, but where they find people who are able to work and they find places for them, they need to make sure that they move there. There has to be an education to understand that you may like this traditional lifestyle, but you're sentencing your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to a life of poverty if you stay here. This land does not have enough value for you and your descendants to live. So if you value their lives, you have to move.
What do you think of the role that the UNDP and other agencies of the United Nations play in assisting with some of the low-income economies for the reduction of poverty?
Of course, the influence of international organizations such as UN and UNDP, UN family is very influenced in developing countries especially. So when we are creating the new strategies, so we are with their support we can implement the new strategies and new reforms. So I think they have a big potential, and also they have a global plan global overview. So that's why I think this is very important. And also 2030 agenda, also SDG agenda, is very important because our country's strategy also is created under these SDGs. Because the SDG also was created by all members of this global society. So that's why I think
I take a dimmer view of it. I'm sorry, because quite frankly, what happens is you have people who are not from the country making policies or trying to impose a kind of one-size-fits-all poverty reduction. I think that's wrong. It doesn't work. If the UN Development Agency had adopted something similar to China, and I mean the process of it, you wouldn't have the poverty you had today, because they look at each individual circumstance rather than just passing broad programs that work somewhere or they think will work in this particular locale.
We not only discuss the issue about bread and butter, but also why we feel safe in a certain country like China. Okay. In the United States, you have the gun-related violence that kills an average of, 15,000 people, according to a survey of the FBI. Or someone would put it at 30,000 each year,
including
gun-related violence. China, many experts here say in China we don't have the feeling of living in fear. It's partly because of, say, we don't have that amount of people unemployed. In South Africa, ironically, despite the introduction of democracy in 1994 with the election there, people don't feel safe. Johannesburg is the city that boasts of the highest crime rates because of robbery, theft, so on and so forth. So what do you think of the importance of poverty reduction on the basic need of feeling safe?
Oh, yes. Just like you mentioned, in some countries, at evening or midnight,
when the night falls,
we dare not to go out.
A feeling of being unsafe.
Right. But in China, in any cities, any place, it's no problems for you to do your things.
And the deployment of millions of hidden cameras as part of a CGTN would minimize the impact of, say, such a arrest.
So I think
of course, this is controversial for the West observers.
I think briefly, I think that development is the most important human rights. For
the issue of human rights. I mean, that's so important.
Also,
for the image of China.
For those very basic, public service. For example, electricity in China. Everyone can access to electricity, but in other developing countries, many people can't. So without electricity, can you imagine you can escape from poverty? That's a big problem. So also other infrastructures. Meanwhile, in China, we also have our saying that is 授人以鱼不如授人以渔. Give you money, give you equipment, and after a short term, and everything is still over the existing. But if you can accept education and training courses, your capacity improved, and then you can deal with problems.
I want to go back to the civil society argument. The primary duty of a government is to allow you to be safe in your home, in your schools, in public places, in your places of worship, wherever it is that you go. If a society fails that, the government has failed. And I don't think anyone, there's any question that that is a litmus test. The second part of that is within a society you have to offer opportunity. There has to be some movement. It cannot be a static society where you're destined and your children and your great-grandchildren are destined to follow your footsteps because there's no other way. So these are the two most important things. The poverty reduction is all about this idea of providing opportunity and hope, linking societies together, giving people a reason to believe in their country. And the primary one of providing basic security is necessary to a society. Otherwise, it breaks down.
Yes, indeed. Live and let live, and also to enjoy a sense of dignity for people in particularly developing countries. These are things that should be prioritized on the agenda of low-income economies with the help of the United Nations and other multilateral institutions. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.